Fact 1. The medieval bestiary. The medieval bestiary was more than just a collection of animal descriptions. It was a window into the medieval mind, reflecting their understanding of the natural world, morality, and religion. These illustrated volumes, immensely popular from the 12th century onwards, presented animals, both real and imagined, not primarily as biological entities, but as symbols. Each creature was imbued with allegorical meaning, often used to teach moral lessons and reinforce Christian doctrine. The origins of the bestiary can be traced back to the Physiologus, a Greek text compiled in Alexandria sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD. This work, which described a variety of animals and their symbolic significance, was translated into Latin and other languages, becoming a foundational text for later bestiaries. The Physiologus drew upon a range of sources, including classical natural history, folklore, and Christian scripture, weaving together observations of the natural world with moral and religious interpretations. Medieval bestiaries typically included descriptions of animals such as lions, eagles, wolves, and elephants, alongside fantastical creatures like unicorns, griffins, and dragons. Each entry would begin with a description of the animal's physical characteristics and habits, followed by an allegorical interpretation. For example, the lion, often described as the king of beasts, was seen as a symbol of Christ, its strength and nobility representing Christ's power and majesty. The pelican, believed to pierce its own breast to feed its young with its blood, was a symbol of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. The unicorn, a mythical creature with a single horn, was often associated with purity and grace, and its capture was seen as an allegory for the Incarnation. The illustrations in bestiaries were as important as the text. These vibrant and often stylized images helped to convey the symbolic meaning of the animals, making them more accessible to a wider audience, including those who were illiterate. The illustrations were not always accurate representations of the animals. Instead, they were designed to emphasize certain characteristics or to evoke specific emotions. For example, a dragon might be depicted with fiery breath and sharp claws, emphasizing its dangerous and destructive nature, while a lamb might be shown with a gentle expression and a fleece of white wool, symbolizing innocence and purity. The bestiary's influence extended beyond the realm of literature and art. Its ideas and images permeated medieval culture, appearing in sermons, poems, tapestries, and sculptures. The moral lessons conveyed through the bestiary helped to shape medieval attitudes towards the natural world and reinforced the importance of Christian values. The creation of a bestiary was a complex process, often involving the collaboration of scholars, artists, and scribes. The text was typically compiled from a variety of sources, including the Physiologus, classical natural history texts such as Pliny the Elder's Natural History, and contemporary observations of the natural world. The illustrations were often based on existing models, but artists also drew upon their own imaginations and experiences. The scribes would then carefully copy the text and illustrations onto parchment, creating a beautiful and enduring work of art. Despite their popularity, bestiaries were not without their critics. Some scholars questioned the accuracy of their descriptions and the validity of their allegorical interpretations. However, the bestiary remained a powerful and influential force in medieval culture for centuries, shaping the way people understood the natural world and their place within it. They were a constant reminder of moral lessons, often linking the natural and supernatural worlds to provide guidance on living a righteous life. As time went on, the bestiary began to evolve. Later versions included more detailed descriptions of animals and incorporated new scientific knowledge. However, the allegorical interpretation remained a central feature, ensuring that the bestiary continued to serve as a source of moral and religious instruction. The legacy of the bestiary can still be seen today in the way we use animal symbols in literature, art, and popular culture. From the lion as a symbol of courage to the dove as a symbol of peace, the animals of the bestiary continue to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us of the enduring power of symbolism and allegory. The medieval bestiary was like an encyclopedia of animals, but instead of just describing them, it gave them symbolic meanings. Lions represented Christ, pelicans symbolized sacrifice, and unicorns embodied purity. These books were beautifully illustrated and were used to teach moral lessons through the animal kingdom. It's fascinating how they used nature to understand their faith and values. Fact 2. The medieval guild system. The medieval guild system was a complex and multifaceted organization that shaped the economic, social, and political landscape of Europe from the 11th to the 16th centuries. Guilds were essentially associations of craftsmen or merchants who practiced the same trade, and they played a crucial role in regulating production, maintaining quality standards, and providing mutual support among their members. Think of them as early versions of professional associations, trade unions, and even social clubs all rolled into one. The origins of the guild system can be traced back to the early Middle Ages, when artisans and merchants began to form voluntary associations to protect their interests and promote their common goals. These early guilds were often small and informal, but as towns and cities grew in size and importance, they became increasingly powerful and influential. By the High Middle Ages, c. 1000 to 1300, guilds had become a dominant force in the urban economy, controlling almost every aspect of production and trade. Guilds were typically organized along craft lines, with separate guilds for blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, bakers, and other trades. In some cases, related crafts might be grouped together into a single guild, while in other cases, there might be multiple guilds for the same craft, each representing a different branch or specialization. For example, in a large city, there might be separate guilds for woolen weavers, linen weavers, and silk weavers. The primary purpose of a guild was to regulate the production and sale of goods within its trade. Guilds set standards for quality, quantity, and price, and they enforced these standards through inspections, fines, and other sanctions. They also controlled access to the trade, limiting the number of apprentices and journeymen who could work in a particular craft. This helped to ensure that there were enough skilled workers to meet demand, but it also protected the interests of existing guild members by preventing overcompetition. Becoming a member of a guild was a long and arduous process. A young person typically began as an apprentice, working for a master craftsman for a period of several years. During this time, the apprentice would learn the skills and techniques of the trade, as well as the rules and regulations of the guild. At the end of the apprenticeship, the apprentice would have to pass an examination, demonstrating their mastery of the craft. If they passed, they would become a journeyman, a skilled worker who could work for any master craftsman within the guild. After working as a journeyman for several years, a person could apply to become a master craftsman. This typically involved submitting a masterpiece, a work of exceptional quality that demonstrated the candidate's skill and creativity. The masterpiece would be judged by the guild masters, and if it was approved, the candidate would be admitted to the guild as a full member. Guild membership came with a number of benefits. Guild members had the right to participate in guild governance, to receive support from the guild in times of need, and to sell their goods in the guild's market. They also had access to the guild's resources, such as tools, materials, and training. In addition, guilds often provided social and religious functions for their members, organizing feasts, festivals, and religious processions. Guilds played a significant role in the social and political life of medieval towns and cities. They often had their own chapels and patron saints, and they participated in civic ceremonies and celebrations. Guilds also exerted political influence, often electing members to town councils and other governing bodies. In some cases, guilds even controlled the government of a town or city. The guild system was not without its drawbacks. The strict regulations and restrictions imposed by guilds could stifle innovation and creativity. The closed membership policies of guilds could also exclude outsiders and prevent social mobility. In addition, guilds sometimes engaged in protectionist practices, using their power to restrict trade and protect their own interests at the expense of consumers. Despite these drawbacks, the guild system played a crucial role in the development of medieval Europe. It helped to create a stable and prosperous economy, to maintain high standards of quality, and to provide social and economic security for its members. The guild system also fostered a sense of community and identity among craftsmen and merchants, contributing to the vibrant and diverse culture of medieval towns and cities. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the guild system began to decline. The rise of capitalism and the emergence of new forms of production and trade challenged the guild's dominance. In many parts of Europe, guilds were gradually replaced by more flexible and competitive economic systems. However, the legacy of the guild system can still be seen today in the organization of labor, the regulation of trade, and the importance of professional associations. They laid the groundwork for many modern institutions. Imagine clubs for every profession back in medieval times. These guilds controlled everything from the quality of bread to the training of blacksmiths. You had to work your way up from apprentice to master, and they made sure things were done right. They also looked after their members and played a big role in how towns were run. It was a whole system designed to keep things organized and fair, mostly. Fact 3. The medieval concept of courtly love. Courtly love, a prominent theme in medieval literature and culture, was a highly stylized and often idealized form of love, particularly between a knight and a noblewoman. It was not necessarily about physical intimacy or marriage, but rather about a refined and often unattainable affection that was expressed through elaborate rituals, gestures, and poetic declarations. The concept of courtly love emerged in the 11th century in the courts of Aquitaine and Provence in southern France, and it quickly spread throughout Europe, influencing literature, art, music, and social behavior for centuries. It's a fascinating look into the romantic ideals of the time, even if they seem a bit strange to us now. The origins of courtly love are complex and multifaceted. Several factors contributed to its development, including the influence of troubadour poetry, the changing social roles of women in the Middle Ages, and the rediscovery of classical literature and philosophy. Troubadours, wandering poets and musicians, played a crucial role in popularizing the ideals of courtly love. Their songs and poems celebrated the virtues of love, beauty, and chivalry, and they often depicted the relationship between a knight and a noblewoman as a source of inspiration and moral improvement. Troubadour poetry emphasized the importance of refined manners, eloquent speech, and selfless devotion, and it helped to create a new model of romantic love that was based on mutual respect and admiration. The changing social roles of women in the Middle Ages also contributed to the development of courtly love. As women gained more power and influence in aristocratic society, they became increasingly idealized as objects of beauty and virtue. Courtly love provided a framework for knights and noblemen to express their admiration and respect for women, while also acknowledging their social status and power. The rediscovery of classical literature and philosophy also played a role in shaping the concept of courtly love. Medieval scholars rediscovered the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other classical authors, and they adapted their ideas about love, beauty, and virtue to the context of medieval society. Classical philosophy emphasized the importance of reason, moderation, and self-control, and these values were incorporated into the ideal of courtly love. The characteristics of courtly love are complex and varied, but some common themes and motifs appear in most accounts. These include idealization of the beloved. The woman is typically portrayed as an object of unparalleled beauty, virtue, and grace. She is often described in terms of conventional symbols of beauty, such as fair hair, rosy cheeks, and bright eyes. Humility of the lover. The knight or nobleman is typically depicted as being humble and subservient to the woman. He is willing to do anything to win her favor, and he accepts her rejection with grace and dignity. Secrecy and discretion. Courtly love affairs are often conducted in secret, as they are typically considered to be adulterous or socially unacceptable. The lovers must be careful to avoid detection, and they must maintain a high degree of discretion. Ritual and ceremony. Courtly love is often expressed through elaborate rituals and ceremonies, such as gift-giving, poetry recitations, and dances. These rituals serve to reinforce the social status of the lovers and to emphasize the importance of their relationship. Unattainability. The object of the knight's affection is often unattainable, either because she is already married, of higher social status, or simply uninterested. This unattainability fuels the knight's desire and inspires him to greater feats of chivalry. Suffering and longing. The knight often suffers from intense longing and despair due to his unrequited love. This suffering is seen as a necessary part of the courtly love experience, as it demonstrates the depth of his devotion. Courtly love had a profound impact on medieval literature and culture. It inspired countless poems, songs, romances, and other works of art. Some of the most famous examples of courtly love literature include Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances, Andreas Capellanus' De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love, and the poems of the troubadours. The ideals of courtly love also influenced social behavior in the Middle Ages. Knights and noblemen sought to emulate the behavior of the heroes in courtly love literature, and they adopted the manners and customs of the courtly tradition. Courtly love became a way of expressing social status and demonstrating one's refinement and sophistication. However, courtly love was not without its critics. Some religious leaders condemned it as being immoral and adulterous. They argued that it undermined the institution of marriage and promoted sinful behavior. Other critics argued that courtly love was unrealistic and impractical, and that it encouraged men to pursue unattainable goals. Despite these criticisms, courtly love remained a powerful force in medieval culture for centuries. Its influence can still be seen today in our romantic ideals and in the way we think about love and relationships. It is important to remember, however, that courtly love was a product of its time, and that its ideals and practices are not necessarily relevant to modern society. It offers a glimpse into a world of elaborate gestures and high ideals, a far cry from modern dating, but incredibly influential for its time. Courtly love was basically the medieval version of a complicated love affair. Think knights writing poems to noble women they probably couldn't or shouldn't be with. It was all about idealizing the woman, acting humble, keeping it secret, and going through rituals. The love was often unrequited, leading to a lot of longing and suffering. It shaped literature and even how people behaved, even though some thought it was a bit ridiculous or even immoral. It's like a historical soap opera. Fact 4. The Medieval Agricultural Revolution. While we often associate revolution with political upheaval and dramatic social change, the medieval agricultural revolution, which spanned roughly from the 10th to the 13th centuries, was a quieter, more gradual transformation that had a profound and lasting impact on European society. It wasn't a single event, but a series of innovations and improvements in farming techniques that led to increased food production, population growth, and significant changes in social structures. This revolution laid the foundation for many of the developments that followed in later centuries. Several key factors contributed to the medieval agricultural revolution. These included the three-field system. Perhaps the most significant innovation was the adoption of the three-field system. Previously, the two-field system was common, where one field was planted with crops and the other was left fallow, unplanted, to recover its fertility. The three-field system divided the land into 3 parts. One field for planting in the autumn, usually wheat or rye. One field for planting in the spring, usually oats, barley, or legumes, and one field left fallow. This system had several advantages. First, it increased the amount of land under cultivation at any given time, from 50% in the two-field system to 66% in the three-field system. Second, the planting of legumes, such as peas and beans, helped to replenish the nitrogen in the soil, improving its fertility. Third, the three-field system provided a more diverse range of crops, which reduced the risk of crop failure and improved the overall nutritional value of the diet. The heavy plow, also known as the carruca, was a significant improvement over the older, lighter plows that were used in earlier centuries. The heavy plow was equipped with a coulter, a vertical blade that cut through the soil, and a moldboard, a curved plate that turned the soil over. This allowed farmers to plow deeper and more efficiently, particularly in the heavy, clay soils of northern Europe. The heavy plow required more oxen to pull it, which led to the development of cooperative plowing arrangements among farmers. The horse collar. The development of the horse collar was another important innovation that contributed to the agricultural revolution. Previously, horses were harnessed using a throat harness, which restricted their breathing and limited their pulling power. The horse collar, which rested on the horse's shoulders and chest, allowed horses to pull heavier loads without restricting their breathing. This made horses more efficient than oxen for plowing and hauling, and it led to the increased use of horses in agriculture. Water and windmills. The increased use of water and windmills for grinding grain also contributed to the agricultural revolution. These mills provided a more efficient and reliable source of power than hand grinding, freeing up labor for other tasks. Water mills were particularly common in areas with fast-flowing rivers, while windmills were more common in areas with open plains and strong winds. Improved crop varieties. Farmers also began to experiment with new and improved varieties of crops. They selected seeds from the plants that produced the best yields and were most resistant to disease. This led to the gradual improvement of crop varieties over time. Manure and fertilization. The importance of manure as a fertilizer became increasingly recognized. Farmers collected manure from their animals and spread it on their fields to improve soil fertility. This practice helped to increase crop yields and to sustain agricultural production over the long term. The consequences of the medieval agricultural revolution were far-reaching. The increased food production led to a significant increase in population. With more food available, people were healthier and better able to resist disease. The population of Europe nearly doubled between the 10th and the 13th centuries. The agricultural revolution also led to changes in social structures. As food production increased, fewer people were needed to work on the land. This led to a surplus of labor, which fueled the growth of towns and cities. People migrated from rural areas to urban centers in search of new opportunities. The growth of towns and cities led to the development of new industries and trades, and it created a more complex and diversified economy. The increased wealth generated by the agricultural revolution also led to the rise of a new merchant class. Merchants traded goods between towns and cities, and they accumulated wealth through their business activities. The merchant class played an increasingly important role in the economy and in the political life of medieval Europe. In addition, the agricultural revolution contributed to the decline of feudalism. As peasants became more prosperous, they were less dependent on their lords. They were able to pay rents in cash instead of labor services, which gave them more freedom and independence. The decline of feudalism paved the way for the development of more centralized states and for the rise of capitalism. In conclusion, the medieval agricultural revolution was a transformative period in European history. It led to increased food production, population growth, changes in social structures, and the decline of feudalism. It laid the foundation for many of the developments that followed in later centuries, and it had a profound and lasting impact on European society. It's a reminder that even seemingly small changes in how we grow food can have enormous consequences. So, back in the Middle Ages, they had a farming upgrade. They figured out the three-field system, which meant more crops. They also invented the heavy plow that could handle tough soil, and the horse collar so horses could pull better. More food meant more people, and people moved to cities to find new jobs. It was a big deal that changed everything from how society was organized to how much power the landowners had. It was the medieval version of a tech boom, but for farming. Fact 5. The Black Death, bubonic plague. The Black Death, a devastating global epidemic of bubonic plague, ravaged Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the mid-14th century. Peaking between 1346 and 1353, it is considered one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia. In Europe alone, it wiped out approximately 30 to 60% of the continent's total population. The Black Death's impact extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. profoundly reshaping European society, economy, and culture. It's a grim reminder of the fragility of human existence and the power of infectious disease. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, primarily transmitted by fleas living on black rats, Ratus ratus. The disease likely originated in Central Asia and spread westward along trade routes, carried by merchants, travelers, and, most importantly, rats and their fleas. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347, when Genoese trading ships returning from the Black Sea docked in Messina, Sicily. These ships carried infected rats and fleas, and the plague quickly spread to other port cities in Italy, France, and Spain. The Black Death manifested in several forms, the most common of which was the bubonic plague. This form was characterized by the appearance of buboes, swollen and painful lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, and neck. Other symptoms included fever, chills, headache, fatigue, and vomiting. The bubonic plague had a mortality rate of 30 to 75% if left untreated. Another form of the plague was the pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs. This form was spread through airborne droplets, making it highly contagious. Symptoms included coughing, sneezing, chest pain, and difficulty breathing. The pneumonic plague was almost always fatal, with a mortality rate close to 100%. A third, less common form of the plague was the septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream. This form was characterized by fever, chills, weakness, and skin lesions. The septicemic plague was also highly fatal, with a mortality rate approaching 100%. The Black Death spread rapidly throughout Europe, facilitated by poor sanitation, overcrowding, and a lack of understanding of the disease's cause and transmission. Medieval cities were particularly vulnerable, with narrow streets, inadequate sewage systems, and close proximity between homes and businesses. People often dumped waste into the streets, providing a breeding ground for rats and fleas. Medieval physicians were largely helpless in the face of the Black Death. They lacked the knowledge and tools to effectively diagnose and treat the disease. Common medical practices included bloodletting, applying leeches, and administering herbal remedies. These treatments were ineffective and often did more harm than good. In the absence of effective medical treatments, people turned to religious explanations and practices. Many believed that the plague was a punishment from God for their sins. They engaged in acts of penance, such as fasting, prayer, and flagellation, whipping themselves, in an attempt to appease God and end the plague. Others blamed minority groups, such as Jews, for poisoning wells and spreading the disease. This led to widespread persecution and violence against Jewish communities throughout Europe. The Black Death had a devastating impact on European society. The massive loss of life led to a labor shortage, which disrupted agricultural production and trade. Many villages and towns were abandoned, and fields were left uncultivated. The scarcity of labor led to increased wages for those who survived, but it also caused inflation and economic instability. The Black Death also had a profound impact on European culture and religion. The experience of widespread death and suffering led to a questioning of traditional religious beliefs. Some people lost faith in God, while others became more deeply religious. The Black Death also inspired a new artistic and literary movement known as the Danse Macabre, Dance of Death, which depicted skeletons and corpses dancing with the living, reminding people of the inevitability of death. The Black Death did eventually subside, but the plague continued to recur in Europe for centuries. Subsequent outbreaks, though less devastating than the initial pandemic, continued to take a toll on the population. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the cause of the plague was identified and effective treatments were developed. The Black Death is a stark reminder of the power of infectious disease to shape human history. It had a profound and lasting impact on European society, economy, culture, and religion. Its legacy continues to resonate today, reminding us of the importance of public health, sanitation, and scientific knowledge in preventing and controlling infectious diseases. It's a powerful example of how a single event can change the course of history. The Black Death was like a giant reset button for Europe. It was a horrible plague that killed off a huge chunk of the population. It spread because of rats and fleas, and people didn't know how to stop it. It led to labor shortages, economic problems, and even religious questioning. People were scared and desperate, and it changed everything about life in the Middle Ages. It's a really dark chapter in history. Fact 6. The construction of medieval cathedrals. The construction of medieval cathedrals was a monumental undertaking, a testament to human ingenuity, religious fervor, and the complex social and economic forces of the time. These towering structures, which still dominate the skylines of many European cities, were not just places of worship. They were also centers of community life, symbols of civic pride, and expressions of the medieval worldview. Building a cathedral was a decades-long, sometimes centuries-long, project that involved the coordinated efforts of thousands of people, from skilled craftsmen to humble laborers. They stand as enduring symbols of the medieval period, and understanding their construction is key to understanding the period itself. The construction of a medieval cathedral typically began with the selection of a site. Cathedrals were often built on sites that had been sacred for centuries, such as former Roman temples or early Christian churches. The site was carefully surveyed and prepared, and the foundation was laid. The foundation had to be strong enough to support the weight of the massive stone structure, so it was often built of layers of compacted earth, rubble, and concrete. The next step was to quarry the stone. Cathedrals were built of stone, usually limestone or sandstone, which was quarried from nearby hills and valleys. Quarrying stone was a difficult and dangerous task, often performed by unskilled laborers using simple tools such as picks, shovels, and wedges. The stone was then transported to the construction site by ox cart or by river barge. Once the stone arrived at the construction site, it was cut and shaped by skilled stonemasons. Stonemasons were highly respected craftsmen who had undergone years of training. They used specialized tools such as chisels, hammers, and saws to shape the stone into the precise dimensions required for the cathedral's design. The stonemasons worked from detailed plans, which were often drawn on parchment and carefully guarded. The construction of the cathedral's walls and vaults was a complex and challenging process. The walls were built of massive blocks of stone, carefully fitted together and held in place by mortar. The vaults, which formed the ceilings of the cathedral, were built using a technique called ribbed vaulting. Ribbed vaulting involved constructing a framework of stone ribs, which were then filled in with lighter materials such as brick or plaster. This technique allowed for the construction of larger and more complex vaults than would have been possible with traditional methods. One of the most distinctive features of medieval cathedrals is their stained glass windows. Stained glass windows were not just decorative. They were also didactic, telling stories from the Bible and the lives of the saints. The stained glass was made by skilled artisans who mixed molten glass with metallic oxides to create a range of colors. The colored glass was then cut into pieces and assembled into intricate designs, which were held together by lead strips. The construction of a medieval cathedral required a significant investment of resources. The money for the construction was typically raised through a combination of donations, taxes, and revenue from the cathedral's estates. The construction was often overseen by a master builder, who was responsible for the overall design and construction of the cathedral. The master builder was a highly skilled architect and engineer, and he was often assisted by a team of skilled craftsmen and laborers. The construction of a medieval cathedral was not just a building project. It was also a spiritual endeavor. The builders believed that they were creating a house for God, and they approached their work with reverence and dedication. The construction of the cathedral was seen as an act of piety and a way to express their faith. The cathedrals were designed to inspire awe and reverence in those who entered them. The soaring heights of the vaults, the colorful light streaming through the stained glass windows, and the intricate sculptures and carvings all contributed to a sense of the divine. The cathedrals were meant to be a glimpse of heaven on earth. The construction of medieval cathedrals had a profound impact on European society. It stimulated economic growth, created new jobs, and fostered a sense of community. The cathedrals became centers of learning and culture, and they played an important role in the development of medieval art and architecture. The legacy of the medieval cathedrals can still be seen today. These magnificent structures continue to inspire awe and wonder in visitors from around the world. They are a testament to the human spirit and a reminder of the power of faith, art, and community. They stand as enduring symbols of the Middle Ages and as a reminder of the ingenuity and dedication of the people who built them. It's a fascinating story of human endeavor, religious devotion, and artistic achievement. Building a medieval cathedral was like a massive, centuries-long construction project. It involved quarrying tons of stone, skilled stonemasons shaping it, and raising huge walls and vaults. The stained glass windows weren't just pretty, they told stories. The whole thing was funded by donations and taxes, and overseen by a master builder. It was a spiritual thing, too, building a house for God. These cathedrals still stand today, testaments to the incredible skill and dedication of the people who built them. Fact 7. Medieval warfare and sieges. Medieval warfare was a brutal and multifaceted affair, a constant presence in the lives of many Europeans. It wasn't just about epic battles fought on open fields. It was also about sieges, raids, skirmishes, and the ever-present threat of violence. From the clash of armored knights to the siege engines that hurled massive stones, medieval warfare shaped the political landscape, social structures, and technological innovations of the era. Understanding medieval warfare is understanding a fundamental aspect of the medieval experience and how power was won and lost. Medieval warfare varied greatly depending on the period, region, and resources available. In the early Middle Ages, warfare was often characterized by small-scale raids and skirmishes, with a focus on mobility and plunder. As the Middle Ages progressed, warfare became more organized and professionalized, with larger armies, more sophisticated weaponry, and more elaborate tactics. One of the most iconic figures of medieval warfare was the knight. Knights were heavily armored warriors who fought on horseback. They were typically members of the nobility, and they were trained from a young age in the arts of war. Knights were bound by a code of chivalry, which emphasized honor, courage, and loyalty. The equipment of a medieval knight was expensive and elaborate. A full suit of armor could weigh upwards of 50 pounds, and it required the assistance of a squire to put on and take off. Knights also carried a variety of weapons, including swords, lances, maces, and axes. Battles in the medieval period were often chaotic and unpredictable. Armies typically lined up facing each other and then charged into battle. The goal was to break the enemy's line and rout them from the field. Battles could last for hours, and they often resulted in heavy casualties. However, battles were not the only form of warfare in the Middle Ages. Sieges were also a common occurrence. A siege involved surrounding a castle or town and cutting off its supplies, forcing the defenders to surrender. Sieges could last for months or even years, and they often resulted in famine, disease, and widespread suffering. Castles were an essential element of medieval warfare. They were built to defend territory, protect resources, and control trade routes. Castles were typically built on high ground and surrounded by thick walls, towers, and moats. They were designed to be difficult to attack and easy to defend. Siege warfare was a complex and challenging undertaking. Attackers typically employed a variety of siege engines, such as catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams, to breach the castle walls. Defenders, in turn, used their own defenses, such as archers, crossbowmen, and boiling oil, to repel the attackers. Sieges were not just about military force. They were also about psychological warfare. Attackers would often try to demoralize the defenders by bombarding them with propaganda, spreading rumors, and threatening to kill civilians. Defenders, in turn, would try to maintain morale by putting on a brave face, rationing supplies, and appealing to their faith. The outcome of a siege often depended on a combination of factors, including the strength of the castle, the size and skill of the attacking army, and the morale of the defenders. Some sieges ended quickly with a decisive victory for the attackers, while others dragged on for months or years, resulting in a stalemate. Medieval warfare was not just about battles and sieges. It was also about raids and skirmishes. Raids were small-scale attacks designed to plunder resources, capture prisoners, and disrupt enemy operations. Skirmishes were small-scale engagements between opposing forces. Raids and skirmishes were a constant threat in the medieval period, and they could have a significant impact on the lives of ordinary people. They could lead to the destruction of property, the loss of life, and the displacement of populations. The impact of medieval warfare on European society was profound. It shaped the political landscape, social structures, and technological innovations of the era. Warfare led to the rise of powerful kingdoms and empires, the development of feudalism, and the creation of new weapons and tactics. Medieval warfare also had a significant impact on the lives of ordinary people. It led to widespread death, destruction, and suffering. It also created opportunities for advancement and social mobility, as individuals could rise through the ranks of the military and gain wealth and power. In conclusion, medieval warfare was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that shaped the course of European history. It was a brutal and often chaotic affair, but it also played a vital role in the development of medieval society. Understanding medieval warfare is essential for understanding the medieval world. It wasn't just glorious battles, but a brutal reality of sieges, raids, and constant threat. Medieval warfare wasn't just knights in shining armor charging at each other. It was about sieges where they'd surround castles and starve people out. They used catapults and battering rams to break down walls. Castles were super important for defense. There were also smaller raids and skirmishes happening all the time. It was a violent period that shaped everything from who was in charge to what kinds of weapons they used. It wasn't a pretty picture. Fact 8. The medieval university system. The medieval university system was a groundbreaking development in the history of education and intellectual thought. Emerging in the High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, these institutions transformed the way knowledge was acquired, disseminated, and debated. They weren't just places to learn. They were hubs of intellectual life, centers of innovation, and incubators for new ideas that would shape the future of Europe. Think of them as the ancestors of modern universities, laying the groundwork for everything we know about higher education today. The origins of medieval universities can be traced back to the cathedral schools and monastic schools of the early Middle Ages. These schools were primarily focused on training clergy, but they also offered instruction in other subjects such as grammar, rhetoric, and logic. As towns and cities grew in size and importance, some of these schools began to attract students from beyond the local area, leading to the development of larger, more specialized institutions. The first universities emerged in Italy and France in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The University of Bologna, founded in Italy around 1088, was initially focused on the study of law. The University of Paris, founded in France around 1150, was initially focused on the study of theology. These early universities were organized as guilds or corporations of students and teachers. The students paid fees to the teachers, and they had a significant say in the governance of the university. The curriculum of medieval universities was based on the 7 liberal arts, which were divided into 2 groups: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Students typically began their studies with the trivium, which provided them with the foundational skills necessary for advanced learning. After completing the trivium, they could move on to the quadrivium or pursue specialized studies in law, medicine, or theology. The teaching methods used in medieval universities were primarily based on lectures and disputations. Lecturers would read and comment on authoritative texts, such as the Bible, the writings of Aristotle, or the works of Roman law. Students would take notes and ask questions. Disputations were formal debates in which students and teachers would argue different sides of a question. Disputations were an important part of the learning process, as they encouraged students to think critically and to develop their own arguments. The language of instruction in medieval universities was Latin, the language of the church and of scholarship. This allowed students from different countries to study together and to communicate with each other. Latin remained the dominant language of scholarship in Europe for centuries. The medieval university system was highly structured. Students typically began their studies at a young age, often around 14 or 15. They would spend several years studying the trivium and the quadrivium, and then they could pursue a bachelor's degree. After completing the bachelor's degree, they could continue their studies and earn a master's degree or a doctorate. The universities were organized into faculties, each of which specialized in a particular subject. The most common faculties were arts, law, medicine, and theology. Each faculty was headed by a dean, who was responsible for the administration of the faculty. The medieval university system played a crucial role in the development of European intellectual life. The universities trained generations of scholars, lawyers, doctors, and theologians who went on to shape the course of European history. The universities also fostered a spirit of intellectual inquiry and debate that helped to advance knowledge and to challenge traditional beliefs. The medieval universities also played a significant role in the development of European culture. They were centers of artistic and literary production, and they helped to spread new ideas and trends throughout Europe. The universities also helped to promote a sense of European identity, as students from different countries came together to study and to learn from each other. Over time, the medieval university system evolved and changed. New universities were founded, and existing universities expanded their curricula and their student bodies. The universities also became more closely integrated into the political and economic life of European society. The legacy of the medieval university system can still be seen today. Modern universities are based on many of the same principles and practices as their medieval predecessors. They are still centers of learning, research, and intellectual debate, and they continue to play a vital role in the development of society. The system of degrees, faculties, and academic disciplines that we know today can all be traced back to the medieval university system. It's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge has a long and rich history. Medieval universities were like the first versions of college. They started as schools for training priests, but grew into centers for all kinds of learning. Students learned Latin, debated ideas, and could earn degrees. These universities helped spread knowledge and shaped European culture. They're the reason we have universities today. Fact 9. Medieval pilgrimages. Medieval pilgrimages were far more than just religious journeys. They were profound experiences that touched upon every aspect of medieval life. A pilgrimage was a journey to a sacred place, undertaken for religious reasons. These destinations were often sites associated with saints, relics, or miraculous events. But beyond the religious motivations, pilgrimages were also social events, economic drivers, and powerful expressions of faith, penance, and hope. They were a central part of the medieval worldview, and understanding them is key to understanding the spiritual and social landscape of the time. They were like the superhighways of faith in the medieval world. The practice of pilgrimage dates back to the early days of Christianity, but it became particularly popular in the Middle Ages. Several factors contributed to the rise of pilgrimage during this period, including the increasing veneration of saints and relics, the development of new transportation networks, and the belief that pilgrimages could offer spiritual benefits, such as the forgiveness of sins or the healing of illness. Some of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in the Middle Ages included Jerusalem, the Holy Land where Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected, was the ultimate pilgrimage destination for Christians. Pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem to visit the holy sites, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believed to be the site of Jesus' tomb. Rome, the capital of the Christian world, Rome was home to the Vatican and the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul. Pilgrims traveled to Rome to visit these sacred sites and to seek the blessing of the Pope. Santiago de Compostela, located in northwestern Spain, Santiago de Compostela was believed to be the burial place of Saint James the Apostle. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, known as the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, became one of the most popular pilgrimages in Europe. Canterbury. Following the martyrdom of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170, Canterbury Cathedral became a major pilgrimage destination in England. Pilgrims traveled to Canterbury to visit Becket's tomb and to seek his intercession. Preparing for a pilgrimage was a significant undertaking. Pilgrims often had to save money for months or even years to cover the costs of travel, lodging, and food. They also had to obtain letters of safe passage from local authorities and to make arrangements for their families and property in their absence. Pilgrims typically traveled in groups for safety and companionship. They wore distinctive clothing, such as a pilgrim's hat, cloak, and staff, to identify themselves as pilgrims. They also carried a scrip, a small bag for carrying food and other supplies. The journey itself was often long and arduous. Pilgrims traveled on foot, by horseback, or by boat, often facing difficult terrain, harsh weather, and the threat of bandits and highwaymen. They relied on the hospitality of monasteries, churches, and private individuals along the way for food and lodging. Pilgrims faced many challenges and dangers on their journeys. They could be robbed, attacked, or even killed. They could also fall ill or suffer from exhaustion. However, they were often sustained by their faith and by the support of their fellow pilgrims. Upon reaching their destination, pilgrims would typically visit the sacred site, pray, and offer gifts or donations. They might also participate in religious ceremonies or receive blessings from priests or monks. The experience of visiting a sacred site was often deeply moving and transformative for pilgrims. Pilgrimages had a significant impact on medieval society. They stimulated economic growth, as pilgrims spent money on food, lodging, and souvenirs. They also promoted cultural exchange, as pilgrims from different regions and countries came into contact with each other. Pilgrimages also played a role in the spread of religious ideas and practices. Pilgrimages were not just individual journeys. They were also communal experiences. Pilgrims often formed strong bonds with their fellow travelers, sharing stories, songs, and prayers. They also participated in communal activities, such as feasts, festivals, and religious processions. The decline of pilgrimage in the late Middle Ages was due to several factors, including the rise of Protestantism, the increasing cost of travel, and the outbreak of wars and plagues. However, pilgrimage continues to be an important religious practice in many parts of the world today. Medieval pilgrimages offer a fascinating glimpse into the religious and social life of the Middle Ages. They were journeys of faith, hope, and penance, and they had a profound impact on the lives of those who undertook them. They were a way to connect with the divine, to experience the world, and to find community. Medieval pilgrimages were like spiritual road trips. People traveled to holy sites like Jerusalem or Rome to visit relics and pray. It was a big deal to prepare for, and they often traveled in groups. The journey could be dangerous, but it was a way to show their faith and connect with others. These pilgrimages boosted the economy and helped spread ideas. It was more than just a trip. It was a life-changing experience. Fact 10. The medieval understanding of medicine and healthcare. Medieval medicine was a complex blend of ancient theories, religious beliefs, practical observations, and folk remedies. It was a far cry from modern medical science, but it represented the best efforts of people to understand and treat illness in a world where scientific knowledge was limited and disease was often seen as a divine punishment or the work of evil forces. Understanding medieval medicine gives us insight into their worldview, their limited understanding of the body, and the often desperate measures they took to combat disease. It highlights both the ingenuity and the limitations of medical practice at the time. Medieval medical theory was heavily influenced by the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, such as Hippocrates and Galen. These physicians believed that the body was composed of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was thought to be maintained by a balance of these humors, while illness was caused by an imbalance. The theory of the four humors was used to diagnose and treat a wide range of illnesses. Physicians would examine a patient's urine, pulse, and other symptoms to determine which humor was out of balance. They would then prescribe treatments designed to restore the balance, such as bloodletting, purging, or changes in diet. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical procedures in the Middle Ages. It involved cutting a vein and draining blood from the patient's body. The belief was that removing excess blood could help to restore the balance of the humors and cure illness. Bloodletting was used to treat a wide range of conditions, from fever to epilepsy. Herbal remedies were also widely used in medieval medicine. Many plants were believed to have medicinal properties, and they were used to treat a variety of ailments. Some of the most common herbal remedies included garlic, ginger, mint, and chamomile. Herbal remedies were often prepared as teas, poultices, or ointments. Surgery was less common in the Middle Ages than it is today, but it was still practiced in certain circumstances. Surgeons performed operations to treat wounds, set broken bones, and remove tumors. Surgery was often a risky undertaking, as it was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Medieval healthcare was not just the domain of physicians and surgeons. Many people also relied on folk healers, midwives, and apothecaries for medical care. Folk healers used traditional remedies and rituals to treat illness. Midwives assisted women during childbirth. Apothecaries prepared and sold medicines and other medical supplies. Hospitals existed in the Middle Ages, but they were not the same as modern hospitals. Medieval hospitals were primarily charitable institutions that provided care for the poor, the sick, and the elderly. They were often run by religious orders, and they focused on providing spiritual comfort as well as medical care. Sanitation was a major problem in medieval towns and cities. Waste was often dumped into the streets, and water supplies were often contaminated. This led to the spread of infectious diseases, such as the plague, dysentery, and cholera. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, had a profound impact on medieval medicine. The plague killed millions of people, and it exposed the limitations of medieval medical knowledge. In the aftermath of the Black Death, there was a renewed interest in medical research and education. Despite its limitations, medieval medicine represented a significant achievement for its time. Medieval physicians and healers made important observations about the human body and the causes of disease. They developed a range of treatments that, while not always effective, provided some relief to the sick and suffering. The medieval understanding of medicine was deeply intertwined with religious beliefs. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God, and healing was seen as a sign of divine favor. Prayers, pilgrimages, and the veneration of saints were often used in conjunction with medical treatments. The medieval approach to healthcare was also shaped by social and economic factors. Access to medical care was often limited to the wealthy, while the poor relied on charity and folk remedies. The status of physicians and healers varied depending on their education, experience, and social standing. In conclusion, medieval medicine was a complex and multifaceted system that reflected the knowledge, beliefs, and practices of the time. It was a far cry from modern medical science, but it represented the best efforts of people to understand and treat illness in a challenging and often dangerous world. It was a mix of superstition, practical knowledge, and a deep desire to alleviate suffering. Medieval medicine was a mix of old ideas, herbs, and prayer. They believed in balancing the humors in your body, and bloodletting was a common treatment. They didn't know much about germs, so sanitation was terrible. Hospitals were more like shelters for the sick and poor. The Black Death showed just how limited their knowledge was. It was a tough time to be sick. Fact 11. The medieval concept of time and calendars. The way medieval people perceived and measured time was vastly different from our modern, clock-driven world. Their understanding of time was deeply intertwined with religious beliefs, agricultural cycles, and the rhythms of daily life. Time wasn't a precise, quantifiable commodity, but rather a more fluid and subjective experience, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing seasons, and the tolling of church bells. Understanding this different perception of time helps us appreciate how their lives were structured and how different their priorities were. Imagine a world where time is more of a suggestion than a rigid schedule. The primary division of time in the Middle Ages was the day, which was defined by the rising and setting of the sun. However, the length of the day varied depending on the season, so timekeeping was not always consistent. The day was typically divided into hours, but these hours were not of fixed length. Instead, they were seasonal hours, which varied in length depending on the time of year. The medieval day was often divided into canonical hours, which were based on the times of prayer in monasteries and churches. These hours included matins around 3 a.m., lauds at dawn, prime 6 a.m., terce 9 a.m., sext noon, none 3 p.m., vespers at sunset, and compline before bedtime. The tolling of church bells marked the beginning of each canonical hour, providing a rhythm to the day for people living in towns and villages. The concept of minutes and seconds was known in the Middle Ages, but it was not widely used in everyday life. Minutes and seconds were primarily used by astronomers and mathematicians for precise calculations. Ordinary people relied on more approximate measures of time, such as a short while, a long time, or the time it takes to walk to the next village. Medieval calendars were based on a combination of solar and lunar cycles. The solar year, which is the time it takes for the Earth to orbit the Sun, was used to determine the seasons and the dates of agricultural festivals. The lunar cycle, which is the time it takes for the Moon to orbit the Earth, was used to determine the dates of religious holidays, such as Easter. The most common type of calendar used in the Middle Ages was the Julian calendar, which had been introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. The Julian calendar consisted of 365 days, with an extra day added every 4 years to account for the fact that the solar year is slightly longer than 365 days. However, the Julian calendar was not perfectly accurate, and it gradually drifted out of sync with the seasons over time. Medieval calendars were often decorated with illustrations and annotations that provided information about religious holidays, agricultural tasks, and other important events. These calendars were not just timekeeping devices. They were also works of art that reflected the cultural and religious values of the time. The medieval concept of time was also influenced by religious beliefs about the beginning and end of the world. Many medieval people believed that the world had been created by God in 4004 BC and that it would end in the year 1000 AD. This belief led to a sense of urgency and anticipation as people prepared for the coming of the end times. The measurement of time became more accurate and standardized in the late Middle Ages with the invention of mechanical clocks. Mechanical clocks were first developed in the 13th century, and they gradually spread throughout Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. These clocks used a system of gears and weights to measure time accurately, and they allowed for the division of the day into equal hours. The widespread adoption of mechanical clocks had a profound impact on European society. It led to a more precise and standardized understanding of time, and it allowed for the coordination of activities on a larger scale. Mechanical clocks also contributed to the development of a more linear and future-oriented view of time, as people became more focused on scheduling and planning their activities. In conclusion, the medieval concept of time was vastly different from our modern understanding. Time was not a precise, quantifiable commodity, but rather a more fluid and subjective experience, shaped by religious beliefs, agricultural cycles, and the rhythms of daily life. The invention of mechanical clocks in the late Middle Ages marked a turning point in the history of timekeeping, leading to a more standardized and linear view of time. It's a reminder that our perception of something as fundamental as time is shaped by culture and technology. Forget smartphones. In medieval times, time was told by the sun, church bells, and the seasons. Hours weren't even the same length all year round. Calendars were based on the sun and moon, and often decorated with art. They even thought the world might end in the year 1000. Later, mechanical clocks changed everything, making time more precise. It was a whole different way of thinking about time. Fact 12. Medieval food and drink. Medieval food and drink were far more varied and interesting than the often stereotyped image of bland porridge and questionable meat. The medieval diet was shaped by a complex interplay of factors, including geography, climate, social class, religious restrictions, and technological limitations. While the vast majority of the population, particularly the peasantry, had a relatively limited and monotonous diet, the nobility and wealthy merchants enjoyed a more diverse and refined cuisine. Exploring the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages offers a fascinating glimpse into the daily lives, social structures, and economic realities of the period. It's a journey into a world of spices, banquets, and the constant struggle for sustenance. The staple foods of the medieval diet varied depending on the region and social class. For the peasantry, grains were the most important source of nutrition. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats were used to make bread, porridge, and other staple dishes. Bread was a ubiquitous part of the medieval diet, and it was often eaten at every meal. Vegetables were also an important part of the medieval diet, particularly for the poor. Common vegetables included beans, peas, lentils, onions, garlic, cabbage, and turnips. These vegetables were often grown in small gardens or gathered from the wild. Meat was a less common part of the medieval diet, especially for the peasantry. Meat was expensive and difficult to preserve, so it was typically eaten only on special occasions, such as feast days or holidays. The most common types of meat were pork, beef, mutton, and poultry. Hunting was a privilege reserved for the nobility, so game animals such as deer, boar, and rabbit were rarely eaten by the poor. Dairy products such as milk, cheese, and butter were also an important part of the medieval diet. Dairy animals were raised on farms, and their products were used to make a variety of dishes. Cheese was particularly important, as it was a good source of protein and could be stored for long periods of time. Fruits were also eaten in the Middle Ages, but they were not as readily available as they are today. Common fruits included apples, pears, plums, cherries, and berries. Fruits were often preserved by drying, pickling, or making them into jams and jellies. Spices played an important role in medieval cuisine, particularly for the wealthy. Spices were expensive and difficult to obtain, as they had to be imported from distant lands. Common spices included pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger. Spices were used to flavor food, to mask unpleasant odors, and to impress guests. The preparation of food in the Middle Ages was often time-consuming and labor-intensive. Ovens were not common in most households, so bread and other baked goods were often cooked in communal ovens. Cooking was typically done over an open fire, which required constant attention and skill. The medieval diet was also influenced by religious restrictions. The Catholic Church prescribed fasting days, during which meat, dairy products, and eggs were forbidden. These fasting days were observed on Fridays during Lent and on other religious holidays. Drink was an essential part of the medieval diet. Water was often unsafe to drink, so people relied on other beverages, such as ale, beer, wine, and cider. Ale and beer were the most common drinks in Northern Europe, while wine was more popular in Southern Europe. Cider was made from apples and was popular in England and France. The wealthy enjoyed a much more varied and refined diet than the poor. They had access to a wider range of foods, including imported spices, exotic fruits, and expensive meats. They also had more elaborate cooking facilities and employed cooks and servants to prepare their meals. Medieval banquets were extravagant affairs that showcased the wealth and power of the host. Banquets typically featured multiple courses of food, elaborate decorations, and entertainment, such as music, dancing, and juggling. They were an opportunity for the nobility to display their status and to impress their guests. The medieval diet was not always healthy. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in the winter months could lead to vitamin deficiencies. The high consumption of salt and preserved foods could contribute to high blood pressure. The constant threat of famine and disease made food security a major concern for many people. In conclusion, medieval food and drink were a complex and fascinating reflection of the society and culture of the time. The medieval diet varied depending on region, class, and religion, but it was always shaped by the need to provide sustenance in a challenging and often unpredictable environment. It was a world of simple staples, rare spices, and the ever-present challenges of food preservation and scarcity. Medieval food wasn't all bland. Poor people ate mostly bread and veggies, while the rich had meat, spices, and fancy banquets. They drank ale, beer, and wine because water wasn't safe. Religion played a role too, with fasting days where they couldn't eat meat or dairy. It was a world where food was often scarce, and getting enough to eat was a daily challenge. Fact 13. Medieval clothing and fashion. Medieval clothing was more than just a practical necessity. It was a powerful symbol of social status, wealth, occupation, and even religious affiliation. The fabrics, styles, and accessories worn by people in the Middle Ages reflected their place in society and conveyed important messages about their identity. From the simple tunics of the peasantry to the elaborate gowns of the nobility, clothing played a crucial role in shaping the visual landscape of the medieval world. Understanding medieval fashion provides a unique window into the social hierarchy, economic conditions, and cultural values of the period. It was a language of fabric, color, and adornment that spoke volumes about who you were. The materials used to make medieval clothing varied depending on availability and cost. The most common fabrics were wool, linen, and hemp. Wool was the most widely used fabric, as it was warm, durable, and relatively inexpensive. Linen was made from flax fibers and was used for undergarments and lightweight clothing. Hemp was a coarse fabric that was used for work clothes and other utilitarian items. Silk was a luxury fabric that was imported from the East and was worn only by the wealthy. Other expensive fabrics included velvet, brocade, and damask. These fabrics were often decorated with embroidery, jewels, and other embellishments. The styles of medieval clothing varied depending on the period and social class. In general, clothing was loose-fitting and draped, rather than tailored to the body. The basic garments for both men and women were the tunic and the gown. The tunic was a simple, T-shaped garment that reached to the knees or ankles. It was typically made of wool or linen and was worn as an undergarment or as an outer garment by the poor. The gown was a more elaborate garment that reached to the floor. It was typically made of wool or silk and was worn by the wealthy. Men also wore breeches, which were loose-fitting trousers that reached to the knees or ankles. Breeches were typically made of wool or linen and were worn with stockings or hose. Men also wore a variety of outerwear, such as cloaks, capes, and surcoats. Women wore a variety of head coverings, such as veils, wimples, and coifs. Head coverings were often required by religious custom and were seen as a sign of modesty. Women also wore belts, which were used to cinch the waist and to carry purses and other items. The colors of medieval clothing were often symbolic. Certain colors were associated with particular social classes, occupations, or religious affiliations. For example, purple was associated with royalty, red with nobility, and blue with the Virgin Mary. Accessories played an important role in medieval fashion. Jewelry, belts, purses, and gloves were all used to enhance the appearance and to convey status. Jewelry was typically made of gold, silver, and precious stones. Belts were made of leather or metal and were often decorated with buckles and ornaments. Changes in fashion occurred slowly in the Middle Ages. New styles and trends typically originated in the royal courts and then gradually spread to the rest of society. Fashion was often influenced by political events, religious movements, and cultural exchanges. Clothing was not just a matter of personal preference in the Middle Ages, it was also regulated by law. Sumptuary laws were enacted in many European countries to control the consumption of luxury goods and to maintain social distinctions. These laws often restricted the types of fabrics, colors, and styles of clothing that could be worn by different social classes. The production of medieval clothing was a labor-intensive process. Fabrics were often spun and woven by hand. Garments were sewn by tailors and seamstresses who worked in workshops or in private homes. The production of luxury clothing required the skills of specialized artisans, such as embroiderers, jewelers, and furriers. In conclusion, medieval clothing and fashion were a complex and fascinating reflection of the society and culture of the time. Clothing was a powerful symbol of social status, wealth, occupation, and religious affiliation. It played a crucial role in shaping the visual landscape of the medieval world and in conveying important messages about identity. It was a visual language that spoke of power, piety, and position in a rigidly structured society. Medieval clothes were like a social uniform. What you wore showed if you were rich or poor, what job you had, and even your religion. Wool was common, but silk was for the wealthy. Colors had meanings, and laws even controlled what people could wear. It was a world where clothes weren't just about comfort, but about making a statement. Fact 14. Medieval music and entertainment. Medieval music and entertainment were integral parts of life, providing both solace and celebration in a world often marked by hardship and uncertainty. From the sacred chants that filled cathedrals to the raucous performances of traveling minstrels, music and entertainment encompassed a wide range of forms and functions, reflecting the diverse social classes, religious beliefs, and cultural traditions of the period. Exploring this sonic and performative landscape reveals the creative spirit of the Middle Ages and the importance of art in everyday life. It's a journey from the hushed reverence of a monastery to the lively chaos of a town square. Medieval music can be broadly divided into two categories: sacred and secular. Sacred music was primarily associated with the church and was used in religious services and ceremonies. Secular music was performed outside of the church and was used for entertainment, celebrations, and social gatherings. The dominant form of sacred music in the Middle Ages was Gregorian chant, also known as plainsong. Gregorian chant was a monophonic single melody form of vocal music that was sung in Latin. It was named after Pope Gregory I, who is traditionally credited with codifying the chant repertory. Gregorian chant was used in the Mass, the Divine Office, and other religious services. This purpose was to create an atmosphere of prayer and contemplation. As the Middle Ages progressed, new forms of sacred music began to emerge, including polyphony, music with multiple independent melodies. Polyphony was first developed in the 12th century at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Composers such as Léonin and Periton created elaborate polyphonic compositions that were used in the Mass and other religious services. Secular music in the Middle Ages encompassed a wide range of genres, including songs, dances, and instrumental pieces. Troubadours and trouvères were traveling musicians who composed and performed songs about love, chivalry, and courtly life. They were particularly popular in France and Southern Europe. Minstrels were professional entertainers who performed a variety of musical and theatrical acts. They often traveled from town to town, entertaining audiences in taverns, marketplaces, and royal courts. Instruments played an important role in medieval music. common instruments included the lute, the harp, the viol, a stringed instrument similar to a violin, the recorder, the flute, the bagpipes, and various percussion instruments. Instruments were used to accompany singers, to provide dance music, and to perform instrumental pieces. Entertainment in the Middle Ages was not limited to music. Theatrical performances were also popular, particularly during festivals and holidays. Mystery plays and miracle plays were religious dramas that depicted scenes from the Bible or the lives of the saints. These plays were often performed in churches or town squares and were designed to educate and entertain the public. Mummery was a form of folk drama that involved masked performers who traveled from house to house, entertaining people with songs, dances, and skits. Mummery was particularly popular during the Christmas season. Jousting tournaments were a form of entertainment that was popular among the nobility. Jousting involved two knights on horseback who charged at each other with lances, attempting to unseat their opponent. Jousting tournaments were often elaborate affairs that involved feasting, music, and other forms of entertainment. Animals were also used for entertainment in the Middle Ages. Bear baiting and cockfighting were popular forms of entertainment that involved pitting animals against each other in a fight. These activities were often brutal and were condemned by some religious leaders. Storytelling was a common form of entertainment in the Middle Ages. Storytellers would travel from town to town, reciting epic poems, tales of adventure, and humorous anecdotes. Storytelling provided a source of entertainment and information for people who were illiterate or who did not have access to books. In conclusion, medieval music and entertainment were diverse and vibrant aspects of medieval life. From the sacred chants of the church to the secular songs of the troubadours, music and entertainment provided solace, celebration, and a sense of community in a world often marked by hardship and uncertainty. They were integral to religious worship, courtly life, and the daily experiences of ordinary people. Medieval music was a mix of church chants and traveling musicians. Troubadours sang about love, and minstrels performed in towns. They played instruments like lutes and harps. Entertainment included religious plays, masked performers, jousting, and even animal fights. Storytelling was also popular. It was a world filled with different ways to have fun and express themselves. Fact 15: Medieval justice and law. Medieval justice and law were a complex and often contradictory system, reflecting the decentralized political landscape, the influence of religious beliefs, and the varying customs and traditions of different regions. It was a world where justice could be swift and brutal or slow and convoluted, depending on your social status, the nature of the crime, and the local lord or judge. Understanding medieval justice offers a glimpse into the power dynamics, social hierarchies, and moral values of the time. It reveals a system that was both deeply flawed and surprisingly sophisticated, struggling to balance the need for order with the realities of a violent and unpredictable world. Unlike modern legal systems, medieval law was not codified into a single, comprehensive body of legislation. Instead, it consisted of a patchwork of different sources, including customary law, Roman law, canon law, church law, and royal decrees. Customary law was based on the long-standing traditions and practices of a particular region or community. It was unwritten and was passed down orally from generation to generation. Customary law varied widely from place to place, reflecting the unique history and culture of each region. Roman law, which had been developed in ancient Rome, was rediscovered in the 11th century and began to influence legal thought in Europe. Roman law was more systematic and comprehensive than customary law, and it provided a framework for legal reasoning and argumentation. Canon law was the body of laws that governed the Church. It was based on the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the decrees of church councils. Canon law covered a wide range of topics, including marriage, inheritance, and heresy. Royal decrees were laws issued by kings and other rulers. These decrees were often used to address specific issues or to enforce existing laws. Royal decrees were not always consistently enforced, and their effectiveness depended on the power and authority of the ruler. The administration of justice in the Middle Ages was decentralized. Local lords, town councils, and church courts all had the authority to hear cases and to impose punishments. The king's courts typically handled only the most serious crimes or cases that involved disputes between powerful nobles. Trial by ordeal was a common method of determining guilt or innocence in the early Middle Ages. Trial by ordeal involved subjecting the accused to a dangerous or painful test, such as holding a hot iron or being thrown into a body of water. It was believed that God would intervene to protect the innocent. Trial by ordeal was gradually replaced by other methods of proof, such as witness testimony and documentary evidence. Oaths played an important role in medieval justice. Witnesses were required to swear oaths to tell the truth, and accused persons were often required to swear oaths of innocence. Breaking an oath was considered a serious offense and could result in severe punishment. Punishments in the Middle Ages were often harsh and public. Common punishments included fines, imprisonment, whipping, branding, and execution. The type of punishment depended on the nature of the crime and the social status of the offender. Capital punishment was frequently used for serious crimes, such as murder, treason, and heresy. Executions were often carried out in public as a warning to others. Common methods of execution included hanging, beheading, and burning at the stake. Prisons in the Middle Ages were often overcrowded and unsanitary. Prisoners were typically held in dungeons or towers, and they were often subjected to torture and abuse. Prisons were not intended as places of rehabilitation, but rather as places of confinement and punishment. The concept of due process was not well developed in the Middle Ages. Accused persons were not always informed of the charges against them, and they were not always given the opportunity to defend themselves. Torture was often used to extract confessions. Despite its shortcomings, medieval justice did have some positive aspects. The emphasis on customary law helped to preserve local traditions and to protect the rights of communities. The influence of Roman law contributed to the development of more systematic and rational legal thought. The church courts provided a forum for resolving disputes and for enforcing moral standards. In conclusion, medieval justice and law were a complex and often contradictory system that reflected the decentralized political landscape, the influence of religious beliefs, and the varying customs and traditions of different regions. It was a system that was both deeply flawed and surprisingly sophisticated, struggling to balance the need for order with the realities of a violent and unpredictable world. It wasn't always fair, but it was a crucial part of how medieval society functioned. Medieval justice was messy. Laws came from customs, Roman ideas, the church, and kings. Local lords and church courts did the judging. They used trial by ordeal like holding hot iron and relied on oaths. Punishments were harsh, like whipping and execution. Prisons were awful. It wasn't always fair, but it was how they kept order.